Christmas should be about joy and wonder, but sometimes the most innocent moments hide the darkest secrets. On a freezing December night in 1945, 5 children vanished without a trace. No bodies, no screams, no answers, just flames and silence. What started as a house fire became something far more sinister. A mystery that would consume a family for decades and expose a web of lies that runs deeper than anyone imagined. This isn't just about missing children. This is about the moment when everything you believe gets shattered by the truth. When a simple accident becomes a calculated crime. When the people meant to protect you become the ones who betray you. Tonight, we're diving into one of America's most haunting unsolved cases. The disappearance of the Sodder children. George and Jennie Sodder had built what seemed like the perfect American dream. 10 children, a successful trucking business, and a home filled with laughter in the hills of West Virginia. George had immigrated from Italy decades earlier, working his way up from nothing. Jennie had given him a family that stretched across 2 generations. Their house on the outskirts of Fayetteville was always buzzing with activity. Kids running through the halls, the smell of dinner cooking, the sound of life being lived. But dreams can turn to nightmares in the span of a single night. December 24th, 1945. The air was sharp with winter cold, and Christmas excitement filled every corner of the Sodder home. 9 of their children were there that evening. Only Joe, the second oldest, was away serving his country in the army. The younger ones had just received new toys from the local store and were too thrilled to sleep. Marion, the eldest daughter still at home, stayed up to watch over them as they played on the living room floor. As the night wore on, the family began their usual bedtime routine. George and Jennie retreated to their first-floor bedroom with 3-year-old Sylvia. The older kids headed upstairs to their shared rooms. But Christmas energy kept some of the younger ones awake, their eyes bright with anticipation for morning. Morris and Louie still had chores to finish before they could rest. The animals needed feeding, no matter how cold it got outside. The 2 boys bundled up in coats and hats, stepping from the warmth of their home into the bitter darkness. The contrast was striking. Inside, everything was golden light and comfortable heat. Outside, the world felt still and ominous, like it was holding its breath. By midnight, silence had finally settled over the house. That's when the phone rang. Jennie startled awake, confused and disoriented. Who would call at such an hour? She slipped from her warm bed, leaving George and little Sylvia sleeping peacefully, and made her way to the telephone. As she walked through the house, she noticed something odd. The lights were still on throughout the main floor. They should have been turned off hours ago. The curtains were wide open too, and when she checked, the front door was unlocked. Strange, but not alarming. The kids had probably been too excited about Christmas to remember their usual routine. Jennie picked up the phone and offered a cautious hello. What she heard in response chilled her to the bone. Laughter. Not the warm, joyful kind, but something cruel and mocking. The voice asked for someone who didn't live there. Wrong number, Jennie told them, and hung up quickly. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. She locked the door, closed the curtains, turned off some of the lights, and hurried back to bed. But sleep wouldn't come easily. The phone call had left her unsettled in ways she couldn't explain. Then she heard it. A thump from above, followed by a rolling sound across the roof, like something heavy had landed and tumbled off. Jennie sat up, straining to listen. Just an animal, she told herself. Nothing more. But then came the smell. Acrid and unmistakable. Smoke. Within seconds, Jennie was on her feet, scooping up Sylvia and screaming for George to wake up. Smoke was pouring under their bedroom door like a living thing, thick and choking. They burst into the hallway to find their world ending. Flames were consuming their home, climbing the walls and racing across the ceiling with terrifying speed. George ran for the telephone to call the fire department. The line was dead. No dial tone, nothing. The same phone that had worked perfectly just hours earlier was completely silent. In that moment of panic and terror, numbers became everything. 9 children had been in the house when they went to sleep. Sylvia was safe in Jennie's arms. Marion was awake on the couch downstairs. That left 7 upstairs, trapped behind walls of fire and smoke. George looked toward the staircase leading to the second floor. The heat radiating down was like standing too close to a furnace. The smoke was so thick he could barely see 3 feet ahead. Climbing those stairs would be suicide. But his children were up there. Jennie screamed their names until her voice was raw. George shouted for them to come down, to find a window, to do anything to get out. Then, through the chaos, 2 figures emerged from the smoke and flames. John and George Jr., the 2 oldest boys, stumbled down the stairs with their hair singed and their faces black with soot. They were hysterical, barely able to speak through their coughing. They had tried to reach the younger children's room. They gasped but couldn't get through. The heat was too intense, the smoke too thick. They had been forced to turn back or die trying. Now the count was different. 5 children were still upstairs: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty. 5 kids who should have been coming down those stairs but weren't. George pulled his family toward the door. Every instinct screamed at him to run back into that inferno, to tear the house apart with his bare hands if necessary. But the reality was brutal and undeniable. The second floor was a death trap. Anyone still up there was beyond help. They stumbled outside into the freezing night, their feet bare against the icy ground, their nightgowns offering no protection against the December wind. George didn't hesitate. He ran toward the side of the house where they kept a ladder. If he couldn't go up the stairs, he'd climb to the windows. He'd break through glass and pull his children to safety. But when he rounded the corner, another shock waited. The ladder was gone. Not fallen, not knocked over by wind, simply gone. Desperate now, George ran to their garage. They owned 2 trucks, both in perfect working condition. He could drive one right up to the house, climb on the roof, and reach the second floor windows. He turned the key in the first truck. Nothing. The engine wouldn't even turn over. The second truck was the same. Dead silence. These were vehicles that had run perfectly the day before. George was a mechanic by trade. He knew engines like most people knew their own heartbeat. There was no reason for both trucks to fail simultaneously unless someone had made sure they would. In desperation, George found an old rain barrel near the house. He would throw water on the flames, do something, anything to help. But when he tried to lift it, he discovered the water inside was frozen solid. Even this small mercy was denied to them. So George did the only thing left to him. He stood in the snow in his nightclothes and screamed his children's names at the burning house. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, Betty, over and over until his throat was raw and his voice was gone. The only answer was the roar of flames consuming everything he had built. While her family stood helpless, Marion ran barefoot down the dark road toward their nearest neighbor. The phone in their house was dead, but maybe another line would work. The cold cut through her thin nightgown like knives, and the distance felt endless. When she finally reached the neighbor's house and pounded on the door, they let her in without question. Her hands shook as she dialed the operator. No response. The system seemed to be failing everywhere. Seeing her distress, the neighbor grabbed his coat and promised to drive into town to alert the fire chief personally. Fire Chief Morris was sound asleep when the neighbor arrived at his door. Once he understood the situation, Morris began the process of notifying the volunteer firefighters. Fayetteville's department operated on a phone tree system, where each firefighter called the next on the list. It was slow and inefficient, but it was their system. What happened next defied all logic and explanation. The Sodder house was only 2.5 miles from the firehouse. On a normal night, the volunteers could have been there in minutes. Instead, 7 hours passed before the first fire truck arrived at the scene. 7 hours. By the time help came, the sun was rising on Christmas morning, and there was nothing left to save. The house had been reduced to smoldering ash and twisted metal. George and his family had spent the entire night watching their home burn to the ground, knowing that 5 of their children were supposedly trapped inside. When the firefighters finally arrived, there was no urgency in their movements, no frantic searching or desperate rescue attempts. The time for that had passed hours ago. They sprayed water on the ruins and began looking for bodies but found nothing. Not a single bone, not a fragment of clothing, nothing to indicate that 5 children had died in the flames. Fire Chief Morris stood in the ashes and made a declaration that would haunt the Sodder family for the rest of their lives. The fire had burned so hot, he claimed, that it had completely incinerated the children. Not even their bones remained. He declared them dead at the scene. The next day, December 26th, a coroner's jury ruled the fire accidental. By December 30th, death certificates had been issued for all 5 missing children. A state police inspector attributed the blaze to faulty electrical wiring. Case closed. It all happened with breathtaking speed. The same officials who had taken 7 hours to respond to a house fire were suddenly moving with lightning efficiency to declare the matter resolved. To George and Jennie, something felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. But what could they do? Their children were gone. Their home was ash, and the authorities had spoken. The Sodders tried to move forward. George brought in dirt to cover the ruins and planted a memorial garden where their house had stood. They began planning to rebuild their lives from nothing. If the story had ended there, it would have been a tragedy, heartbreaking but final. The Sodder family could have grieved their loss and eventually found some measure of peace. Instead, what they discovered in the months that followed would shatter everything they thought they knew about that terrible night. Evidence that would suggest the fire was no accident. Clues that would indicate their children might still be alive. Revelations that would expose a conspiracy so twisted and vindictive that it would consume the rest of their lives. The truth was about to surface, and it was far more horrifying than anything they could have imagined. The first crack in the official story came in the spring of 1946. George was overseeing construction of their new home when a telephone repairman approached him with a discovery that would change everything. The worker had climbed a nearby telephone pole to examine the remnants of the wire that had once connected to the Sodder house. What he found defied every explanation the authorities had given. The telephone wire hadn't melted in the fire. It had been cut, cleanly, deliberately, with precision that could only come from human hands. Someone had climbed that pole with tools and severed their connection to the outside world, and they would have needed a ladder to reach it. A ladder. The word hit George like a physical blow. He dropped what he was doing and ran across the property, searching frantically through bushes and debris. His heart pounded as he made his way toward the back of the lot where the yard sloped into a ditch. There, half hidden among the weeds and rubble, he found what he was looking for: their ladder, the same one that had been propped against the side of their house for years, the one that had mysteriously vanished on the night when he needed it most to save his children. It hadn't been misplaced or knocked down by the wind. Someone had deliberately moved it, hidden it where it couldn't be found in the chaos and darkness. George felt the world spinning around him. Every detail from that night suddenly took on sinister new meaning. The wrong number call in the middle of the night. the thump on the roof followed by that rolling sound. The trucks that wouldn't start despite being in perfect condition. The phone line that worked fine until suddenly it didn't. This wasn't an accident. Someone had planned this down to the smallest detail, but there was something else. Something that proved the fire couldn't have started from electrical problems like the investigators claimed. George forced himself to remember that night clearly. When they had emerged from their bedroom into the living room, the house had been brightly lit. Not just from the flames, but from the electric lights that were still burning throughout the first floor. If an electrical short had caused the fire, the power would have failed immediately. The house would have been dark except for the glow of flames. But the lights were on, exactly as Jennie had left them when she went back to bed after that strange phone call. The electrical system was working perfectly when the fire started. Someone had set their house ablaze deliberately. And if that was true, what else had the authorities gotten wrong? Jennie found herself questioning everything she'd been told. The officials had been so quick to declare her children dead, so eager to close the case and move on. But the more she thought about it, the more the official story crumbled under scrutiny. Why hadn't there been any screams or cries for help during the fire? 5 children trapped upstairs and not one sound of distress. Why were there no remains found in the wreckage? She'd heard about other house fires where complete skeletons were recovered even after buildings burned for hours. How could 5 bodies simply vanish without a trace? The questions tormented her day and night. She began conducting her own experiments, taking animal bones from their kitchen scraps and placing them in their oven at the highest temperature setting. No matter how long she left them or how hot the oven got, the bones remained intact. Charred and blackened, but still recognizably bones. A local crematorium operator confirmed her suspicions. Human bones don't simply disappear in house fires. Even at temperatures far exceeding what their wooden home could have generated, skeletal remains would survive. The absence of any trace of her children's bodies wasn't proof they had died. It was proof they hadn't been in the fire at all. But if they weren't in the fire, where were they? Jennie knew her children well enough to know they wouldn't have wandered off on their own. Maurice was 14, old enough to find help if they had somehow escaped the house and gotten lost. The younger ones would have stayed with him. If they had fled the fire but succumbed to the cold, their bodies would have been found by now. That left only one possibility, one that was almost too terrible to consider. The fire had been a diversion, a cover for the real crime. Her children hadn't died that night. They had been kidnapped. The realization hit her like lightning. Someone had orchestrated this entire nightmare. They had cut the phone lines, disabled the trucks, moved the ladder, and set the house ablaze. All to create chaos and confusion, while they made off with 5 innocent children. But who would do such a thing? And why? George and Jennie began looking back at the months leading up to the fire, searching for clues they had missed. Every strange interaction, every uncomfortable encounter suddenly seemed significant. George remembered a man who had come to their house several months earlier, claiming to be looking for work. George had told him they weren't hiring, but the stranger had lingered, walking around their property and making odd comments. He had pointed to the electrical fuse boxes on the side of their house and declared, "This is going to cause a fire someday." At the time, George had dismissed the comment as nonsense. The power company had recently inspected and approved their electrical system, but now he wondered if the man had been making a prediction or issuing a threat. Jennie recalled another disturbing incident. She had been working in the kitchen when she noticed a strange car parked across the street. Inside sat a man who seemed to be watching their house intently, studying their children as they came home from school. The way he stared at them had made her deeply uncomfortable, but the car had driven away once the kids were safely inside. Had someone been planning this for months? studying their family, their routines, their vulnerabilities. But the most chilling suspect was closer to home. George had fallen out with a business associate over politics. The man, who we'll call Nick, was a fellow Italian immigrant, but their views on Mussolini couldn't have been more different. George was an outspoken critic of the fascist dictator, while Nick supported him passionately. Their final argument had been vicious and personal. Nick had stormed out of George's office, shouting threats that echoed in George's memory like a curse. "Your house is going up in smoke," Nick had screamed. "Your children are going to be destroyed. You're going to pay for the dirty remarks you've been making about Mussolini." At the time, George had thought it was just angry rhetoric from a man who had lost his temper. Now those words felt like a confession. The Sodders shared their suspicions with local police, who agreed to investigate and put up notices, asking for information about the missing children or the fire. What came back was a series of revelations that painted an even more disturbing picture. A witness came forward, claiming to have seen someone removing items from the ashes on the morning after the fire, before the area had been properly searched. Police tracked down the individual, a local man named Lonnie Johnson with a history of theft. In his possession, they found a block and tackle that belonged to George. Under questioning, Lonnie made a stunning admission. He had been at the Sodder property the night before the fire. He had taken their ladder and used it to cut the telephone line. His excuse was that he planned to steal something and wanted to prevent the family from calling police if they caught him. But he claimed he never actually stole anything that night except for the tool he was caught with, which he took after the house had already burned. It was a bizarre confession that raised more questions than it answered. Why admit to cutting the phone line but deny starting the fire? Why take only one item from the ruins when he could have claimed anything? Lonnie seemed like a small piece of a much larger puzzle. Then came testimony that shattered what remained of the official story. A bus driver came forward, claiming he had witnessed someone throwing what he described as balls of fire at the Sodder house during the night of the blaze. He couldn't explain why he hadn't reported this at the time, but his account suggested the fire had been started deliberately from the outside. Determined to find more evidence, the family returned to search the ruins of their home more thoroughly. It was little Sylvia who made the most significant discovery. The 3-year-old wandered away from her parents and found a strange spherical object in the debris. When George and the older children examined it, they were shocked by what they saw. It was an incendiary grenade, a military weapon designed specifically for starting fires. This would explain the thump on the roof that Jennie had heard just before the fire began, as well as the rolling sound that followed. Someone had thrown this device onto their house to ignite the blaze from above. Here was physical proof that their home had been destroyed by arson, not electrical problems. Military hardware didn't accidentally end up on residential properties. Someone with access to weapons of war had used them against an innocent family. The Sodders rushed this evidence to local authorities, certain that it would finally force them to investigate the fire as a crime. But once again, the police response was baffling. They seemed uninterested in pursuing the matter further, treating the discovery of military weaponry as if it were a minor detail rather than smoking gun evidence of arson. Even more shocking revelations followed. 2 women contacted police with independent claims of having seen the Sodder children alive after the fire. One, who worked at a roadside restaurant hours away from Fayetteville, said she had served breakfast to children matching their description on the morning after the blaze. She remembered them clearly because they were with adults who seemed nervous and spoke in hushed tones. Outside, she had noticed a car with Florida license plates. The second witness worked at a hotel in Charleston and claimed to have seen 4 of the 5 missing children check in around midnight about a week after the fire. They were accompanied by several adults who spoke Italian and acted suspiciously, refusing to provide proper identification or explain their relationship to the children. If these sightings were accurate, it meant the children were not only alive, but had been taken far from home by people who might have connections to George's political enemies. The Italian connection was particularly troubling given the threats Nick had made about George's anti-Mussolini stance. Could fellow Italian immigrants have kidnapped the children as revenge for George's political views? If so, the kids might have been taken back to Italy, thousands of miles beyond the reach of West Virginia law enforcement. Frustrated by the lack of progress from local police, the Sodders appealed to the highest authority they could think of. In 1947, they wrote directly to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, pleading for federal intervention in their case. Hoover's response was swift and devastating. The FBI had no jurisdiction in the matter, he informed them. This was a local issue that should be handled by local authorities, the same authorities who had taken 7 hours to respond to their fire and seemed determined to ignore every piece of evidence that contradicted their hasty conclusions. Refused to give up, the Sodders hired a private investigator in 1947. This decision would lead them down a rabbit hole of corruption and conspiracy that reached into the very heart of their community. What the PI discovered wasn't just evidence of a cover-up. It was proof that the people they trusted most had betrayed them in the cruelest way possible. The investigator began questioning locals about the fire and kept hearing the same disturbing rumor. Fire Chief Morris, the man who had declared their children completely incinerated, had supposedly found human remains in the ashes, but instead of reporting this discovery, he had allegedly placed the organ in a wooden dynamite box and buried it somewhere on the Sodder property. The story made no sense. Why would Morris hide evidence of the children's deaths? Why bury it in secret rather than inform the family? But the rumor was so persistent, coming from so many different sources, that the PI felt compelled to investigate. Armed with shovels, the Sodders returned to their memorial garden and began digging. It felt like desecrating sacred ground, disturbing the flowers they had planted in memory of their lost children. But they had to know the truth, no matter how painful. Their shovels struck something solid, a wooden box, exactly as the rumors described. Inside was a piece of flesh, dried and shriveled beyond recognition. For a moment, hope and horror warred in their hearts. Was this finally proof of what had happened to their children? A local funeral director examined the contents and delivered another shocking revelation. It wasn't human remains at all. It was beef liver, completely unburned, despite supposedly being recovered from a devastating house fire. When confronted, Fire Chief Morris made a confession that was somehow both innocent and deeply disturbing. He admitted to planting the fake evidence himself. Watching the Sodders tear themselves apart, searching for answers, had been too much for him to bear, he claimed. He thought that if they found what they believed were their children's remains, they might finally accept their deaths and find peace. It was a twisted act of misguided compassion that only added to their torment. But Morris's bizarre scheme raised even more questions. When the Sodders went to retrieve the liver from the coroner's office for further examination, they discovered it had vanished without explanation. Nothing in this case stayed consistent for long. Every answer led to 3 new questions. Every piece of evidence seemed to disappear or change when examined closely. It was as if invisible hands were constantly moving pieces on a chessboard, ensuring the truth would never fully emerge. But the private investigator had saved his most damning discovery for last. He had been digging into George's former business associate, Nick, the man who had threatened that their house would burn and their children would be destroyed. What he found was a web of financial motive and corruption that went straight to the heart of the official investigation. Nick hadn't just been a co-signer on George's insurance policy. He had secretly increased the coverage on the Sodder home by $250 right before the fire, without George's knowledge or consent. As a co-signer, Nick stood to benefit financially if the entire family died in the blaze. But that wasn't the most shocking revelation. Nick had been a member of the coroner's jury that ruled the fire accidental. The same man who had threatened the Sodders, who stood to profit from their deaths, had been part of the official panel that decided no crime had occurred. It was a staggering conflict of interest that should have disqualified him immediately. How could someone with such obvious motive and bias be allowed to participate in determining the cause of the fire? The corruption ran deeper than the Sodders had imagined. Armed with this evidence, they went to the local prosecuting attorney and demanded that Nick be investigated. Surely, this was enough to warrant criminal charges. Surely justice would finally be served. The prosecutor looked at their evidence, then back at them, and delivered one of the most chilling responses in the entire case. "I don't want to bring a case against people with whom I live and eat," he told them calmly. The message was clear. This was a small community where everyone knew everyone. Business relationships, family connections, and social obligations mattered more than justice. The prosecutor wasn't going to rock the boat by going after one of his neighbors. No matter what evidence suggested he had done, it was the final betrayal. The system designed to protect them had instead protected their tormentors. Local law enforcement, the coroner's office, the prosecutor's office, all had failed them completely. Some through incompetence, others through what appeared to be deliberate corruption. Years passed. The leads grew thinner, the hope more desperate. By 1953, 8 years after the fire, the Sodders had exhausted every official channel. They had been ignored, dismissed, and stonewalled by every authority figure who should have helped them. So they decided to take their case directly to the public. They erected a billboard on the highway near their home. 5 faces stared out from the sign, frozen in time at the ages they had been when they vanished. Below their photographs, a haunting question. What was their fate? Kidnapped, murdered, or are they still alive? A $5,000 reward was offered for information. The billboard became a local landmark, impossible to ignore for anyone traveling that stretch of road. It was their final desperate plea for answers, a monument to their refusal to let their children be forgotten. Over the next decade, letters poured in from across the country. People claimed to have seen one or more of the Sodder children in distant cities. Every lead, no matter how unlikely, was pursued with desperate hope. George once saw a newspaper photograph of a young girl in New York who resembled one of his missing daughters. He traveled there immediately and demanded to see her, convinced she might be his child. The girl's parents, understandably terrified by this strange man's claims, refused to let him near her. George returned home empty-handed, but not entirely convinced he was wrong. Jennie became equally obsessed, even going so far as to suspect her own brother in Florida might somehow be involved in the kidnapping. She had police check records to verify that all of his children were legitimately his own biological offspring. In 1966, 21 years after the fire, they received a letter from Texas. A woman claimed to have overheard 2 men talking, saying they were Louis and Maury Sodder. George made the long journey to investigate, but the lead went nowhere. The following year brought their most tantalizing clue yet. An envelope arrived with no return address, postmarked from Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a young man with features that could have belonged to the Sodder family. On the back, someone had written Louis Sodder in careful handwriting. The Sodders hired another private investigator to travel to Kentucky and track down the source of the photograph. But after the PI left for Kentucky, they never heard from him again. He simply vanished, taking their money and their last real hope with him. Whether he was a con man who had fled with their payment or something more sinister had happened to him, they would never know. His disappearance was the final crushing blow, the moment when even their stubborn hope finally began to crack. The trail had gone cold forever. So what really happened to the Sodder children on that terrible Christmas Eve in 1945? The truth is, we may never know for certain. But the evidence paints a picture that's far different from the official story of an accidental house fire. Someone clearly wanted to hurt the Sodder family. Whether it was revenge for George's political views, a financial scheme involving the insurance money, or something else entirely, the fire was almost certainly arson. The cut phone lines, the moved ladder, the disabled trucks, the incendiary grenade, all point to a carefully planned attack. But did the children die in that fire, or were they taken? The complete absence of remains is troubling, especially given that bones typically survive even the most intense house fires. The witness accounts of the children being seen alive after the fire, while unverified, are compelling. If they were kidnapped, what became of them? Were they taken by Italian immigrants seeking revenge against George? Were they sold into some form of slavery or abuse? Did they grow up with new identities, never knowing who they really were? Or is the simplest explanation the correct one? That 5 children died in a house fire, their bodies were somehow completely destroyed, and a grief-stricken family created an elaborate conspiracy theory to avoid accepting an unbearable loss. The corruption and incompetence of local officials is undeniable. The conflicts of interest, the rushed investigation, the missing evidence, all of this happened. But corruption doesn't necessarily prove kidnapping. Sometimes incompetent people are just incompetent. What we do know is that George and Jennie Sodder spent the rest of their lives haunted by questions that will never be answered. They died without ever learning what happened to their children. The billboard remained on that highway for decades, a testament to their refusal to give up hope. The unknown can be more torturous than any known tragedy. Grief has stages, but uncertainty is eternal. The Sodders couldn't move through the normal process of mourning because they never knew if there was anything to mourn. Were their children dead and deserving of remembrance, or alive and in need of rescue? That uncertainty consumed them. It turned their remaining years into a living nightmare of false leads and dashed hopes. In some ways, not knowing was worse than any definitive answer could have been. The Sodder children case remains officially unsolved. 5 young lives that vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions, theories, and the haunting faces on a roadside billboard, asking every passerby the same desperate question their parents asked for 40 years. What was their fate? We may never know. But their story serves as a reminder that sometimes the most innocent moments can hide the darkest secrets, and the truth can be more elusive than we ever imagine. The children's faces still stare out from old photographs, frozen in time, waiting for answers that may never come. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty Sodder. Gone, but never forgotten, their mystery endures as one of America's most haunting unsolved cases.